it happens to be a Labour government making this announcement. It could easily be a Conservative government making this announcement.
And saying that you have to have a jury trial in every criminal case may not make sense if that means people are waiting 5 years. But I think he needed a process which allowed him to reflect upon what he'd said in the past.
Hold on, Ed. We just had a conversation about the budget.
And
the billions that was available because they raised taxes went on welfare, right?
Well,
didn't go on courts, buildings, and I think it's widely accepted across the political parties that there is a serious problem in our court system with a massive backlog of cases, and there's a dispute about how the backlog came about. Some people think the court system was underfunded, and my name gets mentioned in that context. Other people say this is all an after effect of COVID and things weren't gripped after that. And others say that our criminal justice system and the legal profession and the like is the last great unreformed public service still operating on rules that existed decades ago. And David Lammy, the new Justice Secretary, I think prayed in aid all of those things, frankly, when he made a somewhat surprising announcement. I mean, it wasn't surprising so much on the day because it had been trailed a little bit, but it certainly wasn't on people's radar, I don't think, a couple of months ago. And that is he announced that for offences, indictable-only offences, where the sentence was likely to be less than 3 years, there would not be a trial by jury, that a judge would rule in the case on whether someone was guilty or not. It built on a report that Lord Leveson, I remember the Leveson report from my time in office, but that was all about the Murdochs and the like. This is a different Leveson report, same judge, and he'd made this recommendation, although he had suggested actually fewer offences going to jury trial, so only kind of murder and rape and the like. But it's a bit of a, when Lammy came to make the announcement, there were more offences that will go to jury trial. But Leveson did say that a judge should sit alongside two magistrates, and that's not been the case in this announcement. So it's a pretty dramatic change. I don't think it's like the most dramatic change since Magna Carta, which is the way some people have been presenting it. And I have to say, I'm pretty sympathetic to it. And I'm not as angry about it or offended about it, or I don't think my liberties are being fundamentally traduced in the way that many of my former colleagues say they are at the moment. But before we get on to the kind of substance of it, let's, Ed, tell me, I mean, this just was not on my radar when we were doing this podcast, like at the beginning of this autumn, as the big thing coming that was going to change our justice system in a pretty marked way.
Yeah, it did rather drop out of the blue. And if you think of the news stories in this sort of Home Office crime space over the last couple of days, on the one hand, we've had a big debate from the Justice Department about jury trials. On the other hand, today it's a splash in the Daily Telegraph, the issue of facial recognition and its use by the police in tackling criminals, and the suggestion that it may be possible to access the passport database in order to check people's faces caught on a CCTV camera or whatever against the passport database in order to identify people who've committed a crime. I mean,
so that's like cameras of, I don't know, people getting off trains at a big railway station will automatically scan every face and pick up. It's the digital age version of the CCTV.
But it could also be that somebody came to my front door to break in and they were caught on my doorbell camera. And the police can then take that image and then check it against the passport database to identify the individual. In the case of the use of facial recognition, it's controversial, particularly in the civil liberties world. Liberty's out sort of saying that this is kind of dangerous and we need kind of big safeguards and we don't want to have the police state.
Presumably they would have been against fingerprinting in the 19th century if they'd been around.
And the same things were said about CCTV when it was growing.
Yes.
Do
you remember when I first became an MP, kind of stop CCTV was quite a big sort of political campaign by people like the Liberal Democrats. And I seem to remember in the various towns I represented in Cheshire, the main thing they wanted was CCTV to stop people nicking things in shops and the like.
And these days, if being on a train, being in a station, being in a shop, and knowing there's CCTV, I think it's actually rather reassuring for people. But, there are issues here which need to be understood. There need to be safeguards. And in this case, the Home Office, over, some months, has been putting it out there, starting a debate about the problem. This is now the beginning of a multi-week consultation on what safeguards we should have. The right way to prepare...
Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp has been saying we need more facial recognition. So the opposition is on board.
Because you're preparing the ground. And if you wanted to move to a restriction on jury trials, you needed to have had a longer period in advance, as opposed to pretty much no period in advance, where you're having a big debate about why are the courts with these big backlogs? What are we going to do to try to make justice speeded up? I think very many people will think people waiting 5 years for a case to come to court is ridiculous. We need to speed things up. Maybe this is the right thing to do, but you have to prepare the ground. And when it just
wouldn't Lammy say, hold on, I got, maybe it was his predecessor, Shabana Mahmood, who commissioned this. When we got this guy, Brian Leveson, to do his report.
Yeah, but you said, George, and you follow these things pretty carefully, and you are quite informed, and you said this week, this came totally out of the blue for you. That suggests to me that the government has not been doing the kind of pitch rolling they'd needed to do over months on this issue. And if you look at the kind of political response, look, it is kind of quite wild. You would think that every case currently goes to a jury, and therefore this fundamental right is being taken away. If you look in civil cases, it's less than 2% of cases go to a jury. Even in criminal cases across magistrates and the Crown Courts, it's only 13% of cases go to a jury. That's because of cases which are lower tariff going to the magistrates, or where people plead guilty. It is true that 65% of court time in the criminal system is taken up with jury trials, but most cases don't go to a jury. So it's not like, it is some kind of massive change. And David Lammy is right to say that the Magna Carta also says, that justice delayed is justice denied. I mean, that is both about the fairness of the process, but also about it being timely. So he has got an argument here. His problem is,
I actually remember in a budget giving some money to celebrate the anniversary of the Magna Carta, mainly so I could make a joke about Ed Miliband and the barons, the Union barons.
The problem, David...
Slightly off the point.
Well, thank you, George. The problem is David Lammy has some form here. This, again, is why he needed to do more ground preparation. First of all, at the time of COVID, when the Shadow Justice Secretary was David Lammy and the Justice Secretary was Robert Buckland, there was a debate about, do we handle the pandemic and the problems in our courts at the time not being able to sit in person, the delays which were going to build up by moving away from jury trials. And David Lammy slammed this as an affront. He basically says that criminal trials without juries is a really bad thing. So there's some explaining he needs to do there. There's also, I think, a very powerful argument which he made back in 2017. He was commissioned to do a review into the way in which unfairness and ethnicity and justice interact by David Cameron, the Prime Minister. And in the review he did into prejudice in the criminal justice system, he reported that jury trials were really important because he called them a filter for prejudice. He said that when a jury retires to make a decision, its members consider the evidence, they discuss the case, and that debate and deliberation acts as a filter for prejudice. To persuade other jurors, people must first justify their decision. Power is never concentrated in the hands of one individual. So I'm quite sympathetic to David Lammy's argument that he's got a massive problem in the court system. And I think very many, for example, viewers of Good Morning Britain will think we need to get on with this. And saying that you have to have a jury trial in every criminal case may not make sense if that means people are waiting 5 years. But I think he needed a process which allowed him to reflect upon what he'd said in the past and show that there was kind of safeguards and an understanding of those difficulties. And because it happened in such a rushed way, he's ended up being more on the defensive than he needed to be. And here's the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick, kind of pointing out David Lammy's track record in a way which is, is challenging.
The best opponent of the Justice Secretary's plans to curb jury trials is the Justice Secretary himself. In 2020, he said, "Criminal trials without juries are a bad idea. You don't fix the backlog with trials that are widely perceived as unfair." In 2017, in his report into prejudice in the criminal justice system, he found juries, and I quote, "act as a filter for prejudice." But now he's become Justice Secretary, he's scrapping the very institution he once lauded. Which is it? Will the real David Lammy please stand up?
Robert Jenrick, by the way, being a pretty effective opposition politician, as we know he is becoming. But I think it is, but the clue's there in opposition. I mean, isn't this one of those classic cases where governments have to do difficult things? And frankly, the right to a jury trial has been restricted over the last couple of hundred years on many occasions, and more cases have been heard by magistrates' courts and the like. And indeed, those statistics you gave earlier shows that's the case. And what happens is, the government makes this kind of hard decision, and the opposition and the kind of civil liberties lobbies get on their high horses about it. I remember when I was an opposition MP, some of the most kind of heated moments as an opposition was when Michael Howard, our leader, who, by the way, had been a pretty authoritarian Home Secretary, was kind of leading the case against the illiberal legislation of Tony Blair and David Blunkett. And I mean, that's what oppositions do. And that's presumably what David Lammy was doing when he was Shadow Justice Secretary. By the way, a reminder of anyone who's paying attention to these things, the fact that David Cameron got David Lammy to do a report, good example of big tent politics. It always works, bringing in people from the other side to do things for you. But, that's what shadows do. And then the real people, the people doing the actual job, have to deal with the truth, which is we've got this big backlog in the courts. And, I think it's one of those things which, frankly, it happens to be a Labour government making this announcement. It could easily be a Conservative government making this announcement. I think you're quite right to ask questions about, how you might have gone about preparing the ground for it. But on the substance, I think there'll be a lot of support. And fundamentally, the justice system is a complete mess. Without getting into a debate about its origins, you have got people caught up for years, not just victims. You've got people who are accused of crimes who either can't serve their sentence and get on with their life or can't be acquitted. And, when I remember as Chancellor looking at the criminal justice system, having long conversations actually with the Lord Chief Justice at the time, and actually providing financial support for the modernisation of courts and digitalisation. But, if you look at all elements of this, look at the legal profession, it's compared to other professions in our country, it's still very, very old-fashioned, and the separation between the barrister and the solicitor. You look at the courts and how they sit, and the fact that they can sit empty, and people don't turn up, and then the whole thing's suspended for a day and everyone sits around doing nothing. You look at the probation service, you look at the prison service. We've had debates on this podcast about prisoners being released and how that process works. I mean, the whole thing is ripe for reform. And I'm in favour of this jury announcement, but I would definitely have put it together with a big package of reform for the court system. If you want to address the austerity argument, which there'll be some people shouting at this thing going, well, yeah, but all right, your money, George Osborne. Okay, you can give them a big dollop of cash as well, but make it aligned to reform. Don't make the mistake that was made with the doctors of not asking for reform in terms of along with money. And and look, again, it's one of those things where actually, a barrister who's a prime minister, Keir Starmer, could be the person who leads a government that reforms our court system, which is long overdue.
But in exactly the same way as you say, the opposition is going to make a big storm about this, and they are. In exactly the same way for the government, the problem is, and this is true for David Lammy, but it was true for past Justice Secretaries under the Conservatives, and probably true for Justice Secretaries under the previous Labour government as well. The easy solutions, the judges are saying, why are you doing this, reducing juries? Just give us more money. And the problem is that this justice system has been underfunded very many years, and the squeeze on justice budgets is continuing now. So very good blog by The Secret Barrister I was reading, Abolishing Trial by Jury, Why is the Government Overlooking the Obvious? And it goes through all the things they should be doing instead. More sitting days, better IT infrastructure, improve the Crown Prosecution Service. The rot set in when Sir Keir Starmer was DPP and the CPS lost nearly a third of its workforce. More police. We've lost experience in the police.
But it's not just about money, Ed.
But a lot of this is about.
Yeah, but it's all. Come on, there
money.
are also cases where a defendant doesn't turn up, or there's a last minute, appeal, and then the court sits there empty. I read a very good piece in the paper this week about how judges still insist on doing all the scheduling themselves. They won't have
court buildings are collapsing. Fixing them will cost money. One of the common causes of delay is the examination of digital devices. There's a year-long wait for those examinations.
Hold on, and we just had a conversation about the budget.
It's not.
And the billions that was available because they raised taxes went on welfare, right?
Well,
didn't go on courts buildings and computers in courts and whatever.
I know, but you're turning this into an argument between you and me. And I'm not. And what I actually said was, of course, the opposition complains. David Lammy did. So does Robert Jenrick. Governments consistently have not funded this well. If you simply funded this by giving more money to judges, and there's been quite a lot more money in the last year to try and speed things up without reform, you are definitely right. You don't get progress. Why is it taking over a year for a mobile phone to be checked for the evidence on that phone to then be used in a court case? That is partly about resources.
Yeah, but
it may not only be about resources.
Yeah, but that's also about, by the way, in courts, defense barristers saying we need to see absolutely everything on this phone, which these days, is way bigger than the British Library in terms of the amount of information people have on their phones.
So it is about more than resources.
Governments have,
but it is about resources.
Yeah, but hold on. Governments have not been prepared to confront the legal profession, to confront some of the vested interests and the kind of outdated practices that have just simply not caught up with them on.
So you didn't confront them. You cut the budgets.
Well, no, I did.
And I have a feeling that may have been done by the previous Labour government and by the current Labour government.
Sorry, actually, first of all, the backlog of cases was falling quite rapidly by 2016. And I had a good deal with the very good Lord Chief Justice at the time, which was, we'll put some more money into digitalisation of these courts, because in those days, a lot of everything was still paper bound. And, but it was about an attempt to get reform. But yeah, it was towards the end of my time. And I just think it's a kind of moment. Anyway, look, I have quite a lot of sympathy for David Lammy because he's got this backlog.
The one thing I don't understand is
he's got to clear it.
The one thing I don't understand is why it needs to be a permanent reform. I mean, why has he said that this is a long-term reform? Why can't it be something that he has to do to restrict jury trials for a period?
You mean you do it as like, for the next 3 years, we're going to be restricting juries. And by the way, at the end of the 3 years, no one would want to reintroduce them, would they?
You could say, well, for the next X years, 3 years, 5 years, we're going to do this. It will save us money. We'll have a clear evaluation process alongside that. And at the end of that, we'll decide whether we think justice has got worse or not. I think that would have actually been a better way to go about this. And look, he'll have to make concessions, although I think in the end Parliament is going to pass this, because I don't think Labour and Conservative MPs will in the end want to vote for slowing down the justice system. And there'll be a rouse in the Lords, and the lawyers won't like it that much. But if he makes sensible concessions, this will go through.
Yes, I think so. But I wouldn't. I mean, I imagine the opposition, and particularly your friends, the Liberal Democrats, will love wanging on about this.
They may do, although kind of victims feel that the court
totally
is letting the court.
By the way, also people, of course, most sympathy is with the victims, but even those who are charged with things, they need this thing dealt with, and if they've got to pay a punishment, they want to pay the punishment and get on with their lives and have a chance of redemption.